It's interesting because we use plants in literally every aspect of our daily life, and yet in the last couple hundred years, human beings have had like the craziest love-hate relationship with plants. In the last few hundred years, with colonization and globalization, a lot of like the Western developed world has had this like wild and crazy obsession with controlling and dominating nature, which is comical at best because nature will outwit, outplay, outlast. It is the true survivor. Nature is like on top of it. Nature has figured this stuff out. So no matter how much we like to think we're controlling something, I mean, it is truly a losing battle to continuously try to dominate nature. It just doesn't work that way. So at best, it's comical and futile, and at worst, it's actually really harmful and damaging, not only to the ecosystem, but to our sustained survival in this place. Now, as a result of this like rapid globalization and industrialization, one thing that has happened all across this planet is kind of like the mixing up of all the plants here. For the time being, and for the purposes of this video, let's categorize plants, for example, into 3 categories. The first are native species. So those are the plants that have existed in a place, a specific place, for thousands and thousands of years, and over like many generations have adapted to the very specific kind of abiotic, climate, sun, water, drainage, and also biotic, like wildlife, conditions of a place. Using movie magic, I'll insert a couple of shots of like native species to this region. This is the amazing wild rose. Ooh la la. We also, of course, have cottonwood trees. Cottonwood trees are the only native tree in this region. These are buffalo beans, which are a medicinal plant, wild. And this here is the blue grama grass. We also have this familiar old beast, the prickly pear cactus. And of course, this is showy milkweed, which is the plant that the monarch butterfly lays its eggs on. And then here we have common yarrow. The second kind of plant are introduced species, or the second category of plant are introduced species. These are things that have been transplanted here from another place. This is especially prominent in like the modern industrial world, where we have globalization and kind of like the sharing of resources all across this planet. We're schlepping stuff here, there, and everywhere. In fact, most of the plants you get at a greenhouse or, at a big box store, those aren't from here. They're schlepping those things in from like the southern United States, Asia, all over the place. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, that's just the way that the world is designed now. And so we're bringing in a lot of non-native introduced species into a new region because maybe they're popular in landscaping, for example, or landscape design. It doesn't matter where you're living. If you see people, posting online these pictures of amazing gardens and you want that garden, you want that cool looking plant, well then you bring that plant, across the planet and plonk it in your yard. This was especially common during like settler days here in Canada and North America, where people were bringing over tons of different plants from like their homelands essentially and transplanting them here. That's how we get a lot of the introduced species we see here today. One other quick thing I'll say about introduced species is that they actually, because they're brought in from somewhere else, most often they don't actually have the adaptations that are required to live in a place like this, especially because the grasslands they're not for everybody. It's a tough environment here, it's dry, it's really windy, it's really cold, it's really hot. Some parts of the year it's really wet. Like, we're all over the place over here. That's right. So introduced species need a certain amount of care. They need looking after. Crops are a great example of this, right? They require watering. They require additional fertilizers and pesticides. Maybe they need some kind of like soil adaptations because the soil doesn't have the right pH, or maybe it doesn't have the right nutrients. So all of those factors need to be taken into consideration when you are introducing a new plant into your ecosystem. In some, introduced species tend to be a little fussier and they need a lot more help. Native species don't need any help. They're adapted for this place. Do you need to water native grasses? Nope. Like, do you need to manage native species? No, they're designed to be able to make it on their own, baby. They're designed for this place. The third category of plants are invasive species. These guys, ugh. Am I right? They're the worst. Basically, they're introduced species that have done a little too well, if you know what I mean. They're pushing all the local plants and like the introduced kind of more mellow plants out of the way. They're like, get out of here. This is my town now. They're taking over. They're out competing all the other plants. Now, on the one hand, good for you, invasive species, way to go. You know, you're doing something right because you're successfully managing to like totally take over. But on the other hand, bad, not good. This aggression will not stand, man. The invasive species are doing too well. They're out competing all the native plants. And when they do that, the reason why that's a bad thing, well, there's several reasons. First, invasive species, when they outcompete all those native plants, they actually reduce the natural habitat of a lot of the wildlife in this place. Keep in mind, the wildlife here has been adapting over thousands and thousands and thousands of years as well, and it's got like its routine down. It knows what it can eat. It knows what plants it needs to like build any shelters or, you know, protect itself, even in terms of how animals use like plants as medicine. So when you disrupt the indigenous like plant species and the plant kind of ecosystem in a region, you're really messing with the entire food web. Right, so the first issue is like outcompeting native plants disrupts the entire food web. The second problem with invasive species is that when you have one plant that's doing so well, it's successfully taking over entire areas of land, it actually ends up decreasing the biodiversity in a region. Instead of having tons of different kinds of grasses and plants and flowers in an area, this plant will take over and it just slowly starts to create kind of a monoculture, like one single plant that takes over the whole area. Now, this crazy video clip I'm showing you, it's not that easy to see, but it's a picture of leafy spurge, which is an invasive species. It's this one. They have the long leaves and this is a small or kind of early plant, but as it grows larger, it has these like big yellow flowers that look like, well, actually they're small yellow flowers, but they look kind of like flying saucers. That's how I remember it. Anyway, these are the plants like the goat program at the city of Lethbridge and Lethbridge Parks are kind of testing over the last couple of years. The goats eat these bad boys down to the nub. It's actually an amazing program for monitoring this invasive species and actually kind of reducing it. But anyway, all of this to say, this kind of second bad thing about invasive species is that they decrease biodiversity in a region. Invasive species, am I right? Now, there are lots of different invasive species, and I'll put like a couple of links in the worksheets and maybe in the description box below. We'll see. Yeah, I'll do that. So I'll include a link in the description box below of different kind of like invasive species that you should watch out for, as well as some amazing resources for understanding like how to plant and access native species, but then also kind of like introduce species that are also drought tolerant and kind of blend well into the ecosystem here without being a little too intrusive, like those invasive little. So one final word on like our complex modern relationship with plants is simply that we are constantly trying to dominate and adapt and change the natural world for our betterment. We cut plants to a uniform length. We select the plants that we like and don't like based on really arbitrary reasons. We use chemicals and pesticides and herbicides to manage plants that would otherwise actually be managed by kind of natural cycles and processes. But because we've removed those things and kind of decreased the biodiversity in our yards, those things have to be managed by us now. We basically make it a lot more work than we need to. And we coiffed and like curate and manicure these natural, not so natural spaces into something very specific. I'm not saying that it's good. I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying one thing that I think is endlessly entertaining is just how much we try to control our yards and the natural world around it. So your third assignment is to look at your own yard and assess what are the native plants in your yard, what are the introduced plants, and what are maybe some invasive species that you actually have on your own property. And think critically as well, how do you control and manage all of the different plants in your home? So in sum, we have like a complex modern relationship with plants. We often try to create and quaff and like control the natural world. We're schlepping stuff everywhere. We're moving plants from point A to point B to point C and not really understanding the impact of those actions on local wildlife and like complex local ecosystems. All right, so I've returned home. Oh, gotta find the cat. Step number one. Look at little Chewy. Back by popular demand, a lot of you have responded to say, where did Chewy go? I haven't seen her in a couple videos. So there she is for you. And here's me bugging her, waking her up from a little nappy poo. Anyway, we're back at home because now it is time to talk about growing food for yourselves, growing food at home. So it's that time of year, folks. Outdoor gardening usually starts after the May long weekend, so it's like the perfect time to start getting your garden together. If you don't want to plant a whole garden, or if you don't have any space in your yard that would kind of work for you, that's totally cool. I would challenge you then to grow something in like a pot or two. That's kind of easy. That's what I'm doing this year with my herbs, with my hoibs. Because I want to try to bring them inside during the winter and like rock some fresh herb over the holidays. For my cooking and stuff like that. Anyway, ramble. The point is, the challenge, like your last challenge, will ultimately be to start growing some of your own food, whether it's in a garden or in a pot or something like that. But not just growing food for yourself. We're also going to be growing some food for local pollinators. And that's like a really important pairing, because if you grow like pollinator-friendly plants, they will attract the native pollinator species like your bumblebees and your butterflies and moths and things like that. And then while they're checking out your kind of beautiful native flowering plants, they'll also then, head on over to your tomato plant or your, zucchini plant and pollinate those as well. But I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's talk about what pollinators are and what pollination is, just that we're all on the same page. Okay, so what is pollination? Well, pollination is how most flowering plants, I think like 75% of flowering plants, actually reproduce or like make more little plants. So pollination is when animals like, your little bumblebees or hummingbirds or butterflies or, various other insects move genetic material or pollen from one plant to another. And this like allows flowering plants to actually reproduce, because the little pollinators, the little bugs, become kind of the way that pollen is transferred from one plant to another. So when a bumblebee, for example, brings pollen from like the blossom of one apple tree to another, the pollen from the first tree goes into the flower of the second tree and causes an apple to start growing. So this is how so many of our favorite foods are created. Without pollinators, we would have like way less food. In fact, it's estimated that 1 out of every 3 bites of food comes from plants pollinated by bees. And researchers, in fact, predict that if the pollinators on this planet were to die off, humans would only be able to grow enough food for 4 years, and then we'd be hooped. And this is because much of the food that we eat relies on pollination. So here are a couple examples. Ooh! So everything from like mangoes, peaches, watermelons, blueberries, cocoa, which is chocolate, potatoes, hello, tater tots, chips, fries, mashed potatoes, all those things, honey, lemons, vanilla, coffee, almonds, grapes, tomatoes, all kinds of stuff, sugar, right? Sugar cane, all kinds of things come from foods, or are foods that come from pollination or rely on pollination. So it's a pretty big deal, folks. All right, so growing plants for pollinators, like specifically native flowers, which attract native pollinating animals, planting those things in your garden will attract pollinators and increase your produce yield. So whatever like human food you're planting, if you plant pollinator food as well, you'll both be winning. Huzzah! So that's your 4th challenge. I want you to connect to plants by trying to grow some. This is a really important connection, I think, the kind of plant to food connection. So plant at least one like vegetable or fruit or berry thing and one, plant that provides food for pollinators. So at least one of each. Take care of them over the season, and then reap your rewards at harvest time. All right, so that's your challenge. Plant a food for you and a food for pollinators. All right, well, that's it for this week. I'll leave you with a little picture of Chewy here. Oh, so cute. Anyway, but before we go, I have a couple of handy gardening tips for those of you who may need them. Okay, so here we go. Number 1, it's totally okay to fail. I literally fail every single day, people, and it's totally fine. I learn and it makes me stronger and more resilient. So if your gardening adventure goes down in a fiery blaze, well, welcome to the club. So keep trying and one day I'll get the hang of it. It's totally possible. This second thing is mulch. So mulch is like a substrate, maybe it's wood chips or leaves or hay or something like that, but it's some kind of organic matter that you put on top of the soil to kind of shade the soil and protect it from too much water loss. As you'll see from my gardening shots, I have yet to do that. And it's making the soil all dry and cracked. But anyway, it's really, really important for the overall health of your yard as it keeps moisture in and it keeps nutrients in and provides, cover for the important insects that actually support plant growth as well. The third piece of advice is watering. Basically, using the watershed map that you made during the water module, hopefully you have an idea of where, moist areas are and dry spots are, so you can kind of plant things that need certain levels of moisture in certain locations. And the fourth is, of course, sunlight. Don't forget, plants need sunlight. But also read the instructions that come with your plant or do a little bit of Googling, because not all plants need the same amount of light. Just like with all things, look to the non-living abiotic, influencers in your yard and make sure that the plants that you have can deal with that. So that's it for this week, you guys. I will talk to you next week. There'll be another video all about climate change. So in the meantime, I hope you have some wonderful outdoor time. Enjoy this beautiful weather. And we'll see you next time. Peace.